Welcome back. This time we're talking about Timeless, Season 1, Episode 14, The Lost Generation. Now, this episode builds on the seismic changes that occurred in the previous episode, Karma Chameleon, and delivered some of its own as well, setting up our trio of heroes for a major confrontation with Rittenhouse over the season's final 2 episodes. The main story is set on May 21st, 1927, the day that Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris after his historic transatlantic flight. Flynn goes back and with the help of his new pilot, Emma, shoots Lindbergh down and kidnaps him because according to him, Lindbergh is a member of Rittenhouse. Meanwhile, back in the present with Wyatt in jail for stealing the lifeboat in the previous episode, our team gains a new member, Dave Bumgardner, a character we met briefly earlier in the season when Wyatt was almost kicked off the team for failing to kill Flynn. They go back in time to find Flynn and rescue Lindbergh with the help of Ernest Hemingway and Josephine Baker. Dave is killed in the ensuing confrontation, and Lucy has a heart-to-heart with Lindbergh trying to convince him to renounce Rittenhouse. Unfortunately for Lucy, her efforts are ultimately unsuccessful, as his life essentially works out the way it did before Flynn's meddling. Back in the present, Agent Christopher is pulled off of the assignment and replaced by an NSA agent, Jake Neville, who we later learn is an agent of Rittenhouse. And with Rittenhouse essentially now having total control over Connor Mason's facility and the lifeboat, Agent Christopher helps Wyatt break out of prison, and this episode ends with our trio along with Agent Christopher planning their next steps to take on Rittenhouse. Now, this episode's main theme is the conflict between fate and free will, shown both with Lucy's conflict of being told by her father that it's her fate to be a member of Rittenhouse, which is very reminiscent to Flynn's argument throughout this season that she is destined to join him because of what he's read in her journal. And Wyatt dealing with something similar, having failed to save his wife and questioning once again whether his wife was fated to die, and therefore he cannot save her. Now, overall, this was a fun episode, even if you take out the long-term implications of it, with some great historical characters and some fun action scenes. But a lot of those developments go right into my typical questions, so I'm going to jump right into those early. So let's start with number 1, Flynn's mission. Now, his particular mission in this episode was to kidnap Lindbergh because he knows that he is involved with Rittenhouse. And as Lucy alludes to, later in life he said a lot of horrible things about a variety of groups. When he and Lucy are talking, he mentions that he is supposed to serve as a distraction for something else, and he was supposed to contact a man named Julian Charvet, the man that Flynn later tracks down and holds at gunpoint. We don't know what happened after that. We still don't really have a good grasp of Emma and how dedicated she is to Flynn's mission. We know that she knew enough about Rittenhouse and was afraid of them enough to abandon her life in the present day to protect her family and live in the past. Overall, she seems okay with Flynn's methods. We're also not sure how much she knows about Anthony and his fate at the end of the last episode. And I really couldn't get a good read on her expression after Rufus essentially throws it in her face. But as I mentioned in my review of last week's episode, her eventual fate may be mentioned in Lucy's notebook, so Flynn already knows. Moving on to number 2, Rittenhouse. There was a lot of discussions in this episode about bloodlines and how membership to Rittenhouse is passed down generation to generation within the family. Lucy begins this episode right where she was at the end of the previous one, talking to her father. And he does give us some more insight on what it's like to be told that you're eventually going to be a member of Rittenhouse, and how he actually rebelled against it at first, and so did his father, although they both eventually came into the fold, and he expects her to do the same. I did find it interesting that Lucy essentially admitted that she was there when Flynn killed the founder, which she mentions to show how horrible human being he was, and her father simply says that they've evolved since then. And with Flynn essentially telling Lucy this entire season what she's destined to do, her father telling her what she's destined to do did not sit well with her at all. As I mentioned already, we don't know what Charvet knew and what he was planning and what Flynn might be able to get out of him, but I can assume that it will lead to whatever his next mission is. As far as Rittenhouse in the present, they now have control of the lifeboat and the facility. with Neville and the rest of his agents under their orders. So much so that Lucy's father actually makes an appearance at Connor Mason's facility. Connor's been a hard character to figure out over the last few episodes, but it didn't take a mind reader to understand the expression on Connor's face when Lucy's father admits that she is his daughter. Now, even with Rittenhouse controlling the facility, they're still dealing with the problems of Rufus being their only pilot and Flynn jaunting around history trying to destroy him. But with Agent Christopher no longer calling the shots, we may see some more direct action against Flynn. Maybe they'll order our heroes to go back in time to murder him as a kid, which would seem to be a pretty straightforward way to end their problem, since they no longer have to worry about any kind of ethical ramifications, since they're obviously not a very ethical organization to begin with. Obviously, all of this is going to depend on what happens over these next 2 episodes. Moving on to number 3, we have Lucy's notebook. I did find it interesting that Flynn did not tell Emma what it was, which again leads me to think that her eventual fate is written in that book. Of course, the biggest development along this line is at the end when Lucy's mother gives her the notebook. And that once again brings up the issue of fate versus free will. Even though Lucy has the notebook, she could choose to never write in it. Of course, this show's not been terribly clear on exactly how paradoxes work, and I would imagine since the notebook apparently traveled through time in the time machine, her refusal to create it would not destroy it. Moving on to number 4, we have Wyatt and his past. Christopher makes an interesting comment about how perhaps he's meant to do something else before time or fate will allow him to save his wife. He takes this to heart and is almost fanatical at the end of the episode when he talks about how he's meant to protect Lucy and Rufus, perhaps believing that he has to do that before he can get his wife. It was sort of a sad but funny moment when Lucy talks about how he's acting like a crazy person, and he mentions that, well, he's acting like her, which really wasn't too far off the mark. And finally, at number 5, we have Lucy's past, and this is really where that whole argument over fate versus free will comes in. And we see that manifest in a number of different ways. Her father talking about her being fated to become a member of Rittenhouse, as well as her conversations with Lindbergh. And he even talks about how her family is a pureblood family, which gave me some Harry Potter flashbacks. She really thought that she had convinced him to abandon his fate and do what was better for him. And it was a pretty big blow at the end when she discovers that he eventually followed through with what he was fated to do. Now, on a more practical matter, Rufus and Wyatt now know who her father is. And although Rufus really didn't take it well at first, they both accept that she has no control over it. And the 3 of them, along with Agent Christopher, are about as close as they've ever been this entire season. So this episode pretty much leaves our heroes in a pretty bad place. Wyatt is a fugitive, while Lucy and Rufus are going to have to continue doing missions with the time machine, knowing that the facility is now under complete Rittenhouse control. And speaking of those future missions, Wyatt's replacement is dead, so who's going to replace the replacement in future episodes? Of course, the biggest news of all, and I didn't know this going in, is that there's only 2 episodes left, which would make this a 16-episode first season. This combined with the 13-episode season for The Good Place, it seems that networks are more willing these days to go with a non-standard episode count, which in both those cases works out pretty well, so they don't have to add a lot of padding to get up to the more standard 22 or 24 episodes. Of course, this also led me to do a little bit of searching and find that the ratings for this show are not terribly good. I remember mentioning in my review of the pilot episode that this really felt like a show that was going to carry me through a season and probably get canceled. I really hope I'm wrong, but looking at the numbers, I can't say I have a huge amount of optimism at this point. But before we have to worry about that, we have 2 more episodes. Now, as far as The Lost Generation goes, what did you think of this episode? What did you think of these developments? And what do you think is going to be next for our heroes? As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other reviews, and until next time, don't drop the liquor.